Good afternoon, it's the Educated Grunt here. Today we're going to be going over my 8th episode on General MacArthur's intelligence chief, G2, in the Korean War, Major General Charles Willoughby. But first, I'd like to take a moment to have you take a look at my sponsors real quick. One is Nick's Haberdashery. Nick's is a online eBay store with a wide selection of products, everything from HVAC parts, brand new, to men's clothing, to books, to toys, to children's clothing, women's clothing, shoes. Nick's has a little bit of everything. I'll be posting a link to that site on the description below. And I'd also like you to take a look at Link's Library. Link's Library is an online, Amazon store that specializes in nonfiction books and a lot of rare and hard to find out of print items as well. I'll also post a description of that in the bottom below with links. U.S. Army General Charles A. Willoughby is most likely the worst intelligence chief the U.S. Army has ever had. Alongside General Douglas MacArthur, whom he served as head of intelligence during the Korean War and World War II, Willoughby is responsible for one of the biggest military disasters in U.S. military history. The rout of the 8th U.S. Army and its South Korean allies in December 1950 from the Yalu River on the border between North Korea and China down to below the 38th parallel, bisecting the Korean peninsula. The Big Bug Out, as the retreat was called, covered some 120 miles in 10 days, and it cost the lives of thousands of American and South Korean soldiers. The North Korean capital, Pyongyang, was captured on October 19th, 1950, and General MacArthur ordered his troops all the way up to the Yalu River. This occurred despite multiple intelligence sources reporting the presence of a sizable Chinese intervention force ready to ambush UN forces and cut their supply lines. MacArthur and his intelligence chief, General Charles A. Willoughby, dismissed these reports. A faithful acolyte and sycophant of the general, Willoughby knew what MacArthur wanted. Throughout his long career as an intelligence officer on the general staff, he discerned that it was always important that his intelligence reports blend seamlessly with what General MacArthur intended to do in the first place, according to David Halberstam in his excellent book, The Coldest Winter, America and the Korean War. Consequently, Willoughby doctored the intelligence in order to permit MacArthur's forces to get where they wanted to go militarily, to the banks of the Yalu, Halberstam stated. Willoughby, also known as Lord Willoughby or Baron von Willoughby, because of his German origins and his love of the Prussian military aristocracy, was not the problem, but merely the symptom of the larger problem in how MacArthur handled intelligence. In short, the general was focused on limiting and controlling the sources of intelligence, not allowing contrary or dissenting opinions, and simultaneously surrounding himself with yes-men who would not disturb the dream world of self-worship in which he chose to live. According to historian William Stuck, you control intelligence, you control decision-making, was one of General MacArthur's old truisms. Willoughby had served on MacArthur's staff since the 1930s in the Philippines. He was MacArthur's only trusted intelligence source. Like no other staff officer, Willoughby reinforced the general's already held views on how to conduct the war and strengthened his interpretations of the North Korean and Chinese intentions. MacArthur denied the CIA in any role in preparing intelligence estimates for the U.S. forces in Korea. The role of Willoughby was sycophant-in-chief turned head of intelligence is unsurprising. Willoughby worshipped MacArthur. During World War II and the Korean War, he worked on a flattering biography of General MacArthur. In 1947, in a letter to MacArthur, Willoughby wrote, "There is no contemporary figure comparable to you. Ultimately, people have been attached to a great leader, to a man, not an idea, to a Marlborough, to a Napoleon, to a Robert E. Lee. Underneath it all, these are age-old dynastic alliances. A gentleman can serve a grand leader that will be a good ending to my career. And as I scan the world, the grand leaders are leaving the arena, fighting a bitter rear guard against the underarm, the faceless mob driven by the Russian hordes." Willoughby had a conspiratorial mind which intertwined with his fanatical anti-communism and hero worship of General MacArthur to distort realities on the ground in Korea and to fit his analytical conclusions. The key to the importance of Willoughby was not his own self-evident inadequacies. It was he represented the deepest kind of psychological weakness in the talented, flawed man he served. The need to have someone who agreed with him at all times and flattered him constantly, David Halberstam writes. Anything MacArthur wanted, Willoughby produced intelligence for. In this case, Willoughby falsified the intelligence reports. He should have gone to prison, said the chief operations officer of the 8th U.S. Army, Lieutenant Colonel John Charles. In October 1950, Willoughby's unwillingness to confront the reality that China was ready to intervene in the war with large forces made him dismiss reports of significant clashes with the Chinese forces, instead stating that the Chinese units encountered by UN forces were small and attached to North Korean forces. When the Chinese forces ambushed and defeated the 8th U.S. Cavalry Regiment at the end of October, early November, only then to disappear in order to lure the UN troops further north, Willoughby admitted that the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, PVA, was operating in North Korea. However, he downplayed their numbers as well as their fighting capabilities. In an intelligence estimates on November 10th and November 15th, 1950, though he did warn that an all-out attack was possible and that China was ready to throw the book at UN forces. At the end of November, when UN forces set on their final push to the Yalu River, Willoughby estimated that there were between 40 and 70,000 Chinese troops in the north. The real number was over 500,000. That he was doing in those days was fighting against the truth, trying to keep it from going from lower levels to higher echelons, where it would have had to have been acted on. A U.S. Army officer serving in Korea said MacArthur at the same time told the troops advancing that they will get Christmas dinner at home. Carlton Swift, the CIA officer working at the U.S. Embassy in Seoul, said about Willoughby, it was as if he was always right, had always been right. Certitude after certitude poured out of him. It was as if there was an exclamation point after all of his sentences. Worse, you couldn't challenge him, because he always made it clear that he spoke for General MacArthur. And if you challenge him, you're challenging MacArthur. So that made it very hard for intelligence in the field to filter up to higher headquarters on something that he had made his mind up on. At the end of October 1950, after the first clash between U.S. and Chinese troops had already taken place, Willoughby emphasized in an intelligence estimate that the auspicious time for the Chinese intervention had long since passed. It is difficult to believe that such a move, if planned, would have been postponed to a time when the remnant North Korean forces had been reduced to a low point of effectiveness, he said in his report. The result was that the UN forces were totally unprepared when the PVA 13th Army Group finally struck on November 25th. Over 450,000 Chinese launched a massive frontal attack against US forces, which were caught spread out and overextended supply lines far in the north. Thousands would die in the ensuing bloody retreat. The collapse of the UN forces resembled the collapse of the French in 1940 and the British at Singapore in 1942. The eminent military historian Max Hastings writes, "It was the longest retreat in the U.S. Army history. Indeed, American soldiers were still retreating by the end of December. In January 1951, Seoul was captured by the Chinese and North Koreans. It was by far the worst military debacle the U.S. Armed Forces suffered in the entire 20th century," Bruce Riddell adds. Thousands were killed or wounded or captured. Morale of the fighting force hit rock bottom. MacArthur panicked and considered the use of nuclear weapons to cut the North Korean and Chinese supply lines. The grim fate that awaited the soldiers and the Marines of the 8th United States Army and 10th Corps were a result of the informational, institutional, and personality factors that distorted Willoughby's judgment and effectiveness, Justin M. Haynes dryly notes in a study for the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. The study singles out Willoughby as the officer most responsible for the failure of the Yalu offensive and the ensuing military disaster. His inaccurate intelligence picture contributed to General MacArthur's flawed understanding of the nature of the Chinese communist intent, the study finds. Willoughby correctly identified the potential threat of the Chinese communist interventions in Korea in the late 1950s, yet failed to acknowledge the significance of Chinese strategic warnings, operational preparations for war, and tactical confirmations of their intentions. Nonetheless, once the Chinese attacked, Willoughby and MacArthur was quick to deny all responsibility for the disaster and told the press that he had known about the real size of the People's Volunteer Army and their intentions all along. During a press conference in the late 1950, he responded to a question about why MacArthur ordered the Yalu offensive. If the general had known the presence of the PVA by saying, "We couldn't just sit passively by. We had to attack and find the enemy's profile." Even in time, some reporters derided him for these statements. In the U.S. Army, many despised him. I was always afraid he would be found murdered one day, because if he was, I was sure they would come and arrest me because I hated him so much, said William J. McCaffrey, who fought at the bloody Battle of Chosin Reservoir in late 1950. When a new American commander, General Matthew Ridgway, took over the war from Douglas MacArthur in 1951, one of his first actions was to diversify intelligence collections and analysis. More than most senior American commanders of his era, Matt Ridgway had a passion for intelligence. David Halberstam writes, among other things, he brought in the CIA to challenge Willoughby's intelligence estimates. It would, however, take until September 1951 for Willoughby to share previous estimates and briefs on Korea with his civilian counterparts. Following that, the accuracy of the intelligence that UN forces had access to markedly improved. Willoughby retired from his post in the same year. Despite his role at the Yalu River disaster, Major General Charles A. Willoughby was never officially reprimanded, and controversy as to what his real responsibilities for the defeat at Chosin were. Indeed, Willoughby remains a member of the Military Intelligence Hall of Fame established by the U.S. Army and Military Intelligence Corps to this day. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to listen to my little class on this portion of the Chosin Reservoir. If you would do me a favor and please like, share my video on Facebook and Twitter, and subscribe. And please leave me a comment or a question or even a criticism below. I would appreciate it. Thank you, and have yourself a wonderful day now.